Today, we're going to talk about auditor appeals. Sometimes, when you're doing an internal audit or a supplier audit or a third party certification audit, you'll have a disagreement between the company that is being audited and the person that is the auditor. Even in an internal audit, you might have a disagreement, particularly if it's an outsider that you've hired as a consultant to come in and do the audit for you. Even though you hired them to come in as an internal auditor, they still have different opinions, different experience, different perspective and expectations than what you have. So, how do you appeal the decision of the auditor? Is there any wiggle room? Does it dig you a deeper hole to argue with the auditor? Are you going to poke the bear and irritate them a little bit and it'll get worse? So, a lot of this is how you go about appealing, not whether you should appeal. If you disagree, no matter what, the first thing you should do is try to say, could you explain to me what the requirement is and how we're not meeting the requirement? That would be a great start. You might ask it in even a different way. Could you explain what the requirement is and what you expect to see for conformity? The way I try to explain it when I do an audit of a company is I say, if I think I might have a nonconformity, the first thing I try to do is go back to what the requirement is. And I say, this is what the requirement is to be compliant. This is what I might identify as an opportunity for improvement. And this is what I would identify as a nonconformity. That way they can sort of see the differentiation between what's compliant and what's not, and what might be something that is in that gray area where I think this is something you need to clarify or improve, but I'm not sure it's a nonconformity. And because I'm not sure, we're going to give you the benefit of the doubt and say this is an opportunity for improvement. A lot of times, where I will draw that line of this is an opportunity for improvement is when the records are okay. What they've done is perfectly acceptable. But what the procedure says they're supposed to do doesn't really meet the requirements. So if the company's doing what they're supposed to, but the procedure doesn't clearly state that, sometimes I say, maybe you should make your procedure a little more precise or a little more detailed, specific on what the person is supposed to do, so I can see clearly 1, 2, 3 is what you're supposed to do, and 1, 2, 3 is what you have done. And that really helps things out and eliminates any potential for future nonconformities. And in the case of nonconformity, when your procedure is very specific and you didn't do that, it's very objective. This is what your procedure says, and you didn't do it. And in fact, a lot of times the nonconformities that we see in an audit are because you didn't follow your procedure, not because you didn't meet the requirements. So if you had written your procedure to match the requirements in the standard or the regulation, you might have been fine. But because you were a little bit beyond that in your specific requirements in your procedure and you didn't follow your procedure, it's a nonconformity. So let's take that scenario. What could we do? So you would say, I'm not sure I understand why this is a nonconformity. You could say, well, we've never received a nonconformity on this area before. That's a waste of your time. The reason why that's a waste of your time is every auditor is supposed to say at the beginning and the end of the audit, audits are just a sampling. So if we don't find something, that doesn't mean everything's okay. We just missed it this time and we might catch it next time, or something along those lines. So saying that it wasn't caught before, that just says the auditor made a mistake last time. Doesn't mean you did something right. So that's not your approach that's going to help you. Another thing that you could do that a lot of people will say is, show me where in the standard it says that. And that's being very confrontational because you're accusing the auditor of being incorrect. You're saying you don't know what the requirement is. I think I know better than you. You show me where you're right and I'm wrong. Maybe you just need to reword that a little bit. Like, I'm not sure I understand what the difference is between conforming for this requirement and non-conforming. Can you explain that to me so I understand what we need to do? So, so the purpose, putting that last part in there, so we know what we need to do to fix this or make this better. That can be all the world of difference. Okay, now the company has by their wording and their demeanor, they've made me feel like they're listening to me. They understand there might be a problem here and they're willing to fix it. And they just want me to clarify what we should and shouldn't do to fix this problem. So a good auditor will go back to the standard and say, here's where it says what you need to do. Here's what your procedure says, and here's what you actually did. And so you might need to go back and review records. Maybe you're just inconsistent. Some records are okay, some records are not okay. So you just need to go back and review your records and make sure they're all consistent, they all comply instead of some are and some aren't. Maybe even the auditor will say, see, this record, this one's good, but this one isn't. And you need to review and see if you have more records that are like that. You might only have one record that's bad and they just happen to find it. You might have 20 records and they only found one. So you've got a lot more that's hidden that they haven't had time to find yet. So you need to understand what they're looking at in terms of regulatory requirements, whether it's a standard or a regulation, what your procedure says, and what they're looking for and what they're seeing that they think isn't non-conforming. And you want to try to get to, if we do this for an investigation to try to find out if there are any more examples of, is that adequate? Do we need to go further back? So if it's a notified body or a certification body, they typically want you to go back to the last audit, which is usually 12 months ago. Might even be 11 months. In some cases, they come every 6 months. So it could be just 6 months ago. And that might be okay. Just go back to the last audit. It will look good then. That'll be fine. In other cases, let's say it's an FDA inspector, they expect you to go back all the way to the last FDA inspection. So that could be 2 years ago, even as long ago as 3 years ago. That's a lot of records to look at. But you don't want to have your investigation be too small, because then they'll issue a warning letter because your corrective action plan wasn't adequate. You didn't say, we're going to go back and we're going to look at all the records for the last 2 or 3 years, see if there were any other examples where we had that problem. So that's the investigation part. Once you do the investigation, you determine a root cause. And so would the root cause be a lack of a clear procedure? So maybe we just need to revise our procedure. Maybe the issue is the records weren't, or the forms that we design aren't well designed, and we need to tweak the form a little bit so it's a little more clear and has, like, maybe we're putting in an initial and we need to put in a signature. Maybe there's no place for a date. Maybe there's no place to put the calibration ID for the measurement device. Maybe we're putting in pass fail, and though that's okay and acceptable for an inspection to have pass fail results, when we do an investigation, we can't go back and see what the actual measurement was. So it makes it difficult for us to do that investigation properly and figure out what the root cause is if we can't see the actual measurement. So maybe that's what they want us to do. So it could be the procedure, it could be the redesign of the form, it could be training. Training's often a problem. You know, the procedure's okay, the form's okay, but this person really doesn't know how to fill it in properly. They put in a common one for the CAPA processes. They put in verification of implementation instead of verification of effectiveness. And those aren't the same thing. So sometimes it's the person's understanding of what the requirements are. They just need more training. We see that a lot in CE marking. A lot of companies they'll follow 14971, but when it comes to CE marking, there are some differences between the risk management requirements in 14971 and what the MDR and IVDR require. For example, in 14971, they require you to only do benefit risk analysis when risks are unacceptable. Whereas in the CE marking requirements for MDR and IVDR, you have to do a benefit risk analysis for every risk and the overall residual risk, regardless of acceptability. So that's a nuance that you need training on to know that. You might not know that you're required to use all of the 23 sections of Annex 1 as inputs into your design. Those are essential requirements for safety and performance. They call them general safety and performance requirements, or GSPRs. They're in Annex 1. You're supposed to know those are design inputs. You may not know that. So it could be a training issue. It could be a resource issue. Maybe you can bring on part-time resources. Maybe you can bring on temps. Maybe the person was on vacation or maternity leave and now they're back and you're going to be okay. So it could be a resource issue, and it could be management oversight. We just forgot to measure that to make sure they were doing it. And because we didn't check on them, they just stopped doing it because people will not do things that nobody's ever asking for. Um, so that it could be management oversight, lack of monitoring and measuring the process for its effectiveness. It could be lack of training. It could be unclear procedures. All of those things are possible reasons for the corrective action. So you might want to ask the auditor, what are you thinking would be an appropriate corrective action? I know you're not allowed to consult here, but is this a revision of the procedure? Is this a retraining issue? You think it's a little of both? Where are you seeing the problem here? Is it just redesigning the form and redo these records? Maybe they will give you that information, maybe they won't. A lot of times what we find when you have a valid reason for appeal is when the auditor says, I can't find this record, and say, oh, I didn't understand that's what you were looking for. We have that over here. Or, oh, the person that you were talking to didn't know that because that's not their area of responsibility. We have that record. You were just speaking to the wrong person. So it's not your fault. It's not our fault. We just didn't know that's what you were looking for, and we had you talking to the wrong person. And so it's not a nonconformity necessarily. It's just you're talking to the wrong person, getting the wrong information. If you can ask the questions to the auditor saying, what is the requirement? What is nonconformity? What are you looking for? Once you understand exactly what they're looking for, you can say, oh, yes, I have that. Or would this be enough? If we made this change, or maybe we don't need to make a change at all, if we just gave you a different record, maybe that'll solve the problem. But you want to understand what the future should look like. So next time when the auditor comes in and asks that question, what should we have ready for them so we don't have a nonconformity like this in the future? Different way of asking that same question. So those are all ways of figuring out what's wrong. Once you know what's wrong, what the auditor expects to see versus what they actually see, now you're in a position you could appeal if you still disagree. If you say, well, now that I understand exactly what you're looking for, we have that over here. If the auditor says, well, I don't have time to look at that now, I'm in a hurry, I need to finish my audit, say, would it be possible for us to give this to you and you could review it remotely after you leave or at the end of the day? No. Could maybe during lunch we can have a working lunch and we can walk you through that? No, don't have time for it. If they're being unreasonable and just a time constraint, you might ask, is there anything that we can do to help you catch up? Are there some records you could ask for right now that we can go get so you're not waiting for anything and there are no delays in the audit? Is there anything we can do to accelerate your job so you do have time to look at that? Sometimes if you're showing effort to help that auditor get their audit done on time and catch up on the audit, maybe they can be reasonable. Maybe asking them right now to look at that record that weren't able to produce when they were originally wanting it, and they're busy on something else now and they don't want to go back. Maybe once you get them caught up a little bit and they feel a little less stressed, maybe that would be a better time to ask that question. So don't force the issue now. Sometimes if you have a little bit more time in the audit, they're going to be there for several days and this is day one. I'll ask that question tomorrow, or maybe I'll send them an email and I'll give them some information and maybe they'll reconsider. But if you get to the point you've asked a couple of times, you understand clearly what the issue is, and you disagree with the auditor still, you feel it's a matter of interpretation. Another approach you could say to the auditors, we disagree. We're not sure we agree on the interpretation of that requirement. We think we meet the requirement. We understand you don't think we meet that requirement. Is there a guidance document that we can look at that would explain the interpretation of this better to us? Now, they're not allowed to give you advice, and you might even say it this way. I know you can't give us advice, but can you point us to a guidance document or some MDCG guidance for Europe or some FDA guidance, something that will explain this requirement better to us so we're interpreting it the same way you are? They're allowed to give you that information. There's no harm in giving them guidance documents. And so it's a very clever way of giving advice to a client. The information you're looking for can be found in this guidance document, and maybe in a certain section you can point them to, and that'll tell them exactly what they want. So now you've taken the effort of, is there a place I can understand this the way you do? And you say, well, the guidance document says exactly what we did. I think we understand this correctly. Maybe they'll reconsider. So now if you've asked once, you've asked them to explain the process to you. They've explained it. You think you're still in the right. You've come back to them again. You've said, well, clearly we're not interpreting it the same way. Is there a guidance document? And then you read the guidance document and you still think you're right. Now you've tried several ways, several different, more subtle, less confrontational ways of trying to understand why the auditor thinks it's a nonconformity, but you still think you're right. You can say, I think we still disagree on this. We've looked at this several times. We've tried to show you other documents. We've looked at the guidance document that explains this to us. We still disagree on this. Is there any way we can appeal this nonconformity? You could ask that. They're all supposed to have an appeals process. So as an internal auditor hired as a consultant to work for a company, what I usually say in the opening and closing meetings is, if there's something here that you disagree with my finding, as long as what you want me to change it to is factual, I'm willing to do that. I'm willing to consider changing my report and my findings as long as it's factual. So if it's a matter of interpretation, I'm willing to rethink this. But it usually doesn't help you. And so if they disagree with me on some points, I say, I could just change that. What you're asking me to change it to is factual. However, I disagree with it, and I don't think it's going to help you. I'm concerned, and you explain what you're concerned about as an auditor. I'm concerned this is going to be a problem later on. I'm concerned you're going to ship non-conforming product. I'm afraid you're going to have a mix-up. I'm afraid somebody's going to get hurt. I'm afraid a third-party certification body is going to come in and say you did this wrong, and I don't want those to happen. So that's why I think this should stay as a nonconformity. You should open up a cap and you should fix it so it never happens again. You may think I'm going too far, but I really don't think I am. And as a professional consultant that does this a lot, I'm probably right. But if they still disagree, I don't want to make enemies with my client. So if they're asking me to do something factual, I'm willing to rewrite something that I probably would have written as a nonconformity as an OFI. And I'll say, well, if I reword it this way, would that be acceptable to you? And they say, yes. Okay. As a third-party auditor, I wouldn't be that flexible. So I would go back to the requirements. I would go to the interpretation. I would explain that to them. And if they still disagree, and say, well, you disagree with me, I am willing to make a phone call to another person at the organization and discuss it with them and see if they feel I'm making a mistake or if they agree with my determination. But I think it's likely they're going to agree with me. And if they really want me to do that, I will make that phone call. I may not get an answer by the end of the audit. So what I may say is, I'm going to write the audit the way it is. This is what the closing meeting is. This is the report I'm going to give you, but I still am going to follow up on this. And if they disagree with my position, then we'll go back and we can revise the report. But if they agree with me, I'll let you know they agree with me and the report will stand as is. And if they still disagree with you, then there is a appeals process. Some of the notified bodies and certification bodies don't have a formal appeal process. So it's really just you appealing to their boss. So it's usually, well, here's the person you can speak with. If you're at, let's say, BSI, when I was a BSI auditor, it was, well, we would defer to the scheme manager that was issuing the CE certificate. And then there was usually a supervisor that was head of all the operations auditors that would also be a person we could communicate with. There were certain people that were trainers that had more experience that we could speak with. But at a certain point, this was your judgment call. You were assigned to the audit. You made a call that we don't see anything technically wrong with what you wrote, so it's going to stand. And the company may still disagree. Sometimes there's a formal appeal process, but sometimes you have auditors that are just wrong. They make mistakes. They feel, this is what I think should be doing, and the company's not doing it. They're not going back to, well, that's not what the standard says. They don't say how to do it. They say what the requirement is, and you decide how you're going to meet that requirement. And so it's worth appealing. I would say roughly about half of the time appeals will work, but it's all in how you do it. If you are confrontational right from the start, you won't make as much progress. The best way to avoid the nonconformity is to try to understand it and persuade them in a very non-confrontational way before they even get to the closing meeting. Once they're in the closing meeting, it's getting harder now, and you're going to have to be more forceful and say, I really disagree with you, and this is why, and I think we need to appeal this. And it's you want to give the impression that it's not that I dislike you, it's not that I think you're being unfair, it's that I just disagree that this is a nonconformity. I think this should be maybe an opportunity for improvement, or not even be something that we're required to do. We feel the way we are doing it is acceptable, so we want to appeal this. And we just want to understand what the appeal process is. And we don't want to tie you up. We don't want to keep you here all day. We don't want to argue about this. We just want to understand what the appeal process is. We think we've tried everything we can during the audit, and the next step will be the appeal. That auditor may say, it's just not worth it. I don't want to deal with an appeal. And they may say, fine, I'll change it. And then you've gotten what you want. But they might say, I disagree. You can appeal it, but good luck. I don't think that's going to happen for you. I think it's going to stay as I've written it. And what you should always do is seek to understand what they have as a nonconformity. Understand what they expect you to do as a CAPA, because you may only have a certain amount of time to respond with a corrective action plan, and your appeal process may take longer than that. In those situations, you really have no choice but to open up a CAPA and give them a plan, and hopefully resolve the appeal before you've had to implement the whole thing. And you got to sometimes pick your battles. If we're talking about a design change that would be overly burdensome and cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars, and there's no evidence of any harm, maybe you're right. Maybe what the auditor thinks you should do is not necessarily what you have to do. But if it's something that they're asking you to revise a procedure and train some people, probably the amount of time that you're going to spend appealing this is not going to be a good ROI on your time. So think about, what is your return here? I'm going to avoid a little bit of work on a CAPA, or is this a big deal? I'm going to have to do redesign of the device. So think about that. Sometimes it's just easier to do what they say, and just make sure that people internally agree with your assessment there. Sometimes they want you to fight back no matter what. And you're going to have to make a judgment call. Which is this one that's worth appealing, or is this not worth appealing? But the right way to do it, non-confrontational, spend extra effort trying to understand what the auditor's perception is. Doesn't mean they're right, just understand what their perception is and what they expect you to do and what they expected to see, so you can understand, is it just we're not giving them a document we already have and we could resolve this very quickly, or is it really their interpretation doesn't match ours? We have an official interpretation that they've identified, and we believe we're okay with that perception or that interpretation, and we can appeal this. Or is it's just not worth it, and let's just write up a CAPA plan. It'll take us less work. So that's kind of the process that you're going to go through to appeal an auditor's decision, but not show me where, why is that? Don't be careful about how you word these things. A smile puts people at ease. lowering your tone, speaking more softly, um, being as really showing it every effort to try to understand is the key here. Understand first before you say I disagree. It's much easier to say I don't understand. Could you help me understand? And you'll have a lot more luck with that appeal. So I hope that helps. If you have a situation where you've gotten a nonconformity and you're trying to come up with a corrective action plan, we have lots of experience on that, both personally as a director of quality for different companies, writing them myself, and a lot of clients. We've had warning letters where we've been able to write the corrective action very quickly for companies, and we know exactly what the auditor's looking for because I personally have written that before myself. So sometimes we can help you really quickly, and we'd be happy to help. So if this was helpful to you, please share the video with others, or if you have any suggestions for future webinars or videos, please comment down below in the comments. And it was a pleasure to see you this Friday and hope to see you next Friday. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.